Hi, welcome back to the next episode of the Keto Naturopath. I'm Dr. Carl Goldkamp. So today we're going to talk about lies. We're going to talk about fat lies. Specifically, we're going to talk about fat lies that surround protein-sparing modified fast and the ketogenic diet. I think it's important that you not look at fat as just a macro. Like the world is so simple, it's simply carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And that's as far as your thinking goes. That's not going to serve you very well. If that's as far as you want to put effort into understanding, you will lead a life probably malnourished because you need to understand more. So I'm going to go a little bit further on some of the basic misconceptions and to prove to you, to give you places where you can go to really understand, because you're going to need to talk to your doctor about the issues of cholesterol, the issues of saturated fats, and you need to understand what they do, okay? And this isn't going to be a big science class. This is going to be about things you can hold in your hand that you know are true and why it's important to you, very important to you. This isn't just academic. This is useful information. Okay, let's get started. So big fat lies about keto and the protein-sparing modified fast. Cholesterol. We're going to start with the big words, okay? Part one. All right, a lipid panel. So a lipid panel, you hear about it. The doctors order lipid panels. They order a lot of other things, CBC, Chem panel, and so on and so forth. But a lipid panel is kind of a universal panel about cholesterol for the most part. It has governed medicine and labs for the last 70, if not 80 years, because they want to know about your cholesterol. Do you have high cholesterol? Do you have high cholesterol? Why do you have high cholesterol? And the assumption was they didn't ask you if it was good or bad. They said, why do you have high cholesterol? Well, now the answer is you better have high cholesterol, higher cholesterol as you get older because it's a health ingredient. It means you're healthy. We'll get there. All right, triglycerides, HDL, high density lipoprotein, and the ratio between the two, we call it trigs to HDL, total cholesterol, LDL, and the cholesterol HDL ratio. These are the things we're going to look at. And they've been looking at that for the last 70 or 80 years. We're going to keep it simple. But first, I want to introduce you to the history of how we've been lied to. Okay, it's called the cholesterol theory of heart disease. And you're going to get my short version of this. Back in the mid-50s, the same person who created the K rations for World War II and the Korean War, that's the rations soldiers still eat out of a can, K rations, came from Ancel Keys, the K being Keys. He became the director or dictator, you might say, of all nutritional thinking for the subsequent 80 years. Pretty impressive. How he did that, I have no idea, but he did. So this is Ancel Keys saying saturated fats make your cholesterol go up. If your cholesterol is high in the blood, it leads to heart attacks and strokes and phlebitis. And so the pharmaceutical industry totally capitalized on that and said, we can do something. They came out with statins. So statins are not just Lipitor, but it's Crestor and Vistor and all these other Tors. And so, and it led to a lot of people having miserable lives associated with increased rates of diabetes, certainly muscle pain. We'll get into that later. But that's the story in a nutshell. Told you it was a short version. Okay, statins in short, shorter. So some studies, so you know I'm not speaking out of the corner of my mouth. Mood, personality, behavioral changes during treatment with statins. There you go. And no, it's people would get weird. They'd get schizophrenic, and you'll hear about some of these. Statins weaken muscles, and those muscles could include the pelvic floor. Effects of statins on skeletal muscle, a perspective for physical therapists, 2010. Statins induced myopathy, meaning disease of muscles. Statins stimulate atherosclerosis, which is the plugging of arteries throughout the body. Primarily, they're referring to the heart and heart failure. Pharmacological mechanisms. Well, wait a minute. You're already doing a pharmacological mechanism, and you're creating the problem that now needs other pharmacological things to have another mechanism. I don't know. Seems pretty suspicious to me. In some, the authors argue that statins may increase the risk of atherosclerosis by increasing artery calcification. Enter CAC score. I hope you all know what your CAC score is. And heart failure by introducing mitochondrial dysfunction and ATP insufficiency. What does that mean? It basically starts shutting down your mitochondria because it's blocking CoQ10, which is critical for the mitochondria. The mitochondria can't produce the energy it's supposed to, which is ATP. And so consequently, you're tired, your muscles ache, and that's the life you lead when you're on a statin. Okay, then. Study links statin to 300 adverse health effects. So these are all the links. Help yourself. But I want to tell you a story first by this person. A doctor, Dwayne Graveline Md. He died about 1.5 years ago, but he always wanted to be an astronaut. He was a doctor. He wanted to be a doctor in NASA. And so basically in the 90s, he was part of the NASA training and so on, and they go through their annual fitness and so on, and his cholesterol was high. So back then the thinking was in 2000, well before 2006, but still in 2006, that, oh, you have high cholesterol, we got to treat that. Give him a statin. So they gave him a statin. And he is one of those people that are more than likely genetically predisposed to a really bad outcome. And so consequently, he would get this thing called total global amnesia. Total global amnesia is, and in his story, it's a great book to read. His story is he would go to Home Depot, pick up the lumber for something he's working on at home. He'd come back home, park the car. He'd turn around and see the lumber in the back seat, and he'd freak out, thinking somebody else was in the car and put their lumber in his car. And he'd get scared. He said, you know, he goes out for drives and comes back and people have been in his car. So that's total global amnesia. So obviously they had to scrub him from NASA because they put him on a statin, knowing that if he was going to go out in a spacewalk, they couldn't have him forgetting why he went out on a spacewalk. And then Dr. Graveline also then wrote another book, The Dark Side of Statins, which goes even further and why cholesterol is so important. So that's an amazing story. It was the first I had heard of it, and it was my early days of practicing, actually. I'd only been practicing 7 years at that point. Here's another person you need to know about. He's a Dane, Ulf Rafskov. And he started in Europe. They were less associated to having to bow to pharmaceutical companies and so on. I'm sorry for the sarcasm. And so they started thinking independently. And he said, I don't believe this cholesterol. I think cholesterol is good for you. I don't think high cholesterol is a bother. Though there is a thing called familial hypercholesterolemia. And for that, if it's very high, and I've had actually a patient of that, it's called FH. And you basically look for the genetic predisposition, and that's a whole different situation. Okay, then. These are books he wrote: Cholesterol Myth, Fats and Cholesterol Are Good for You, Ignore the Awkward, about medicine in general. And he started a critical association of researchers and physicians called the International Network of Cholesterol Skeptics, based out of Denmark. But most of the research is actually coming out of Norway as well, in terms of showing that the older you got, the higher your LDL and total cholesterol had to be, or I should say, the higher your cholesterol and LDL were as you got older, were associated with lower all-cause mortality. So lower causes of death from all causes. All right, cholesterol and why it's not important, why it's not a bad thing. Too low cholesterol is a bad thing. LDL-C, which is pretty much the same thing, does not cause cardiovascular disease, a comprehensive review of the current literature. So why am I showing this to you? Because your doctor probably is saying, wait a minute, you know, your cholesterol is too high. We get it all the time. We go to see our doctor, our insurance covers, and he goes, oh, you should be on cholesterol. You should be on a statin. So I give him this information. He stops talking to me. So there you go. Hope you look these up. This is his newsletter, which is incredible stories, absolutely incredible stories. It starts from 2004 to current, 2020. He only puts this out maybe once or twice a year. He's not about developing a fan group or social media. He's about getting the truth out, and I just love the information he covers. One of the stories that he covers is about egg yolk, bad science and scientific fraud. Back in 2012, I'm all about egg yolks, right? Easy to be all about egg yolks now, but back then, there's a lot of bad information. Eggs were bad. Didn't you know eggs were bad? So everybody was like, no, don't do eggs. So they weren't doing meat, right, for the saturated fats, so they weren't doing eggs. What were they? Where's their nutrition coming from? Plants, veggies. Another story, another time. But I wanted to make this real, so I threw up, you know, just the top slice of patients that we have. You know, this is probably page 1 of 5. Just to go through and heighten, all right, there's everybody. This is a lipid panel that I just told you about. Everybody's cholesterol, everybody's triglycerides. Let's compare these two. Okay, the highest cholesterol is right here. Highest person with cholesterol is right here. And his LDL is also high by standards, because here it's the conventional medicine says you should be under 200 and your LDL should be under 100. What crap. Absolutely, what crap. My total cholesterol is 310 and my LDL is around 200. So this is a 64-year-old man. But let's look at what else he has. He has great triglycerides. He has really good LDL. It could be even a little higher. Let's compare it to the high triglyceride guy. And it is a guy. 408. Wow. Hardly any LDL, hardly any HDL, high density lipoprotein. And now look at his ratio of trigs to HDL, 13:1. That in itself, the trigs to HDL ratio, will show that he's more than likely diabetic. He's certainly insulin resistant. So let's go further. Well, there was so much fat in his blood, they couldn't measure his LDL. And obviously the other ratio was off as well. So there's that. Okay, now let me introduce you to another person that I've seen speak 3 times, David Diamond. He's a neuro researcher, not a neurologist, a neuro researcher at the University of South Florida. I've seen him speak at least 3 times, and he really got into the statistical analysis of the deception of the research that was behind the statin industry for 70 years, and he tore that apart. But here is a good quote from where Ancel Keys in the mid-50s was coming from. He was saying, Americans eat too much fat. Now remember, in the 50s is when Eisenhower had 3 heart attacks while he was still in office. So it's like, well, what are we doing here? And so it was all attention on what makes heart disease, right? So Americans eat too much fat. Most of that fat is saturated fats, the insidious kind that increases blood cholesterol, damages arteries, and leads to coronary disease. The only sure way to control blood cholesterol is to reduce fat in the U.S. diet from 40% to 15%. In other words, cut it by almost 2/3 of total calories. Cut the saturated fat down from 17 to 4%. So he gave the instructions in the late 50s, and it was followed, and it's still being followed by many doctors' offices. I would say the majority, probably 80 to 90%, most doctors, internists, family physicians, general practitioners follow this. He wasn't a doctor. He just had a PhD in fish physiology. How did he get this recognition? Somebody knew somebody. Okay, this is David Diamond. You can get this on YouTube. He has a number of great talks out there. So again, deception and cholesterol research, separating the truth from the profitable fiction. And there's a link for that. There's another one now in 2020. And then another one, he got to speak at what they call IHMC, which is the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. It's a real honor for anybody to speak there. And this is where he actually got started in covering this, saying, it's bogus. This is not true. There's no reason to have a statin. And he's actually very kind about it. Okay, so now back to Ancel Keys. One is, I want to point out, as I say, I have no idea how he became so influential so quickly, but he was Time Man of the Year in January 13th, 1961. So from Eisenhower to Kennedy, he was the guy. He was like the most influential medically related person, even though he wasn't a doctor. Okay, so he came from this thing called 7 Country Studies, in which was a study of, I think, 30, or it might have been as much as 50 different countries, and he extracted 7 and drew his lines together so he'd get his conclusion. Now, what about the other, 43 countries or so? I left them off. So that wasn't discovered until Nino Teicholz, which we'll get to in a second, went through and did all this research on showing how American medicine has been following this and following the advice of the pharmaceutical companies, and how the pharmaceutical companies have been fraudulent on their basis of saturated fats were bad. They're not bad. We'll get more into that. Okay, so I just wanted to open up the labs then to put it into a real world. So this is that panel right in the middle. So what about the guy with really high cholesterol? What's his fasting glucose? It was 103. It's high normal, but it's not high. He's not diabetic at all. What about the guy who had the high triglycerides? What's his fasting glucose? Wow, 201. That's, I think, is the highest I've ever seen. He also has inflammation, fairly severe inflammation. Call that a 3 of CRP, whereas the one in high cholesterol had, well, he didn't get that done. Or I didn't put it in this column. So I can't speak to that. Okay, what else did he had? He had hemoglobin 8.9, of course it would be high. Insulin was 52. This guy is a raging diabetic, and I'm the first to tell him. Okay, what else did he have? He was definitely insulin resistant, and this shows down here the ratio between neutrophils and lymphocytes, which are both white blood cells from a whole different test, shows that he is having an immune dysregulation, an immune function problem. So you can see now, look at all the red. In the very least, look at all the red, and this guy doesn't have much red except for these two. Okay, so this is Nina Teicholz. Here's her a YouTube where she does her presentation on Big Fat Surprise, which was her book from the Keto Institute she did that for. Excellent presentation. And here's the book that came out in 2015. You remember that's when Dr. Diamond was presenting about how statins were not correct. Okay, it's a tome of a book. It does really some good, tedious research about, wait a minute, statins are actually good, and we've been lied to. So she was nice. She wanted to call it a big fat lie, and she thought that was a bit too harsh, so she changed the title to Big Fat Surprise. Good for her. All right, Ansel Keys, back to what we saw before. Saturated fats lead to increased cholesterol. Elevated cholesterol in the blood lead to heart attack. Bogus, bogus, bogus. All right, but that does leave us with a question. So where does saturated fats fall? Are they good, bad, and what's the deal on that? All right, well, here's how you would see saturated fats in terms of butter. Some people say, well, butter, the word butter comes from butyrate, which is a ketone. It doesn't come from butyrate, but it does have some saturated fats in it. And saturated fats, which come from the cow, right? Also, saturated fats are from the meats that you eat. So think of protein-sparing modified fats have probably a pretty significantly high level of saturated fats. At least I hope so. And here's a product we used to have. It's MCT oil, but it was specifically C8. It was caprylic acid triglyceride, so it was only one saturated fat. And here's another, to milk it, no pun intended. Saturated fats in yogurt, cheese, and butter do not increase the risk of heart disease. It may actually prevent a stroke. That was a turnaround, as you might recall. Remember all the low-fat milk or no-fat milk? Bogus. Here's as technical I'm going to get. So when you talk about a saturated fat, I call it a fishing line, and you just simply count up the carbons on it. Here's a fishing line with 8 carbons on it, so that's called caprylic acid. Technically, the cap comes from an old Greek word for goat, because this fat is found in goat's milk, found in milk in general. So caprylic acid, put 3 of them together and you have a triglyceride. That's how it looks also. So ketones are half that. 4 carbons, and here's a 1 carbon ketone. The interesting thing about if you have C8, caprylic acid triglyceride, within 15 minutes your liver will be making ketones with it. Instantaneously. Boom, 15 minutes instantaneously. And here's some research to back that up by Dr. Stephen Canane. You've heard me reference him before, and I've interviewed him on the podcast. So what he did, he compared coconut oil, which has a lot of saturated fats, compared it to C10, which has 2 more carbons, to C8 and C10 combination, to C8 by itself. And he found that caprylic acid triglyceride had the highest level of ketones produced, followed by the C8, C10, and then C10 by itself, not much at all. Okay, caprylic acid, the saturated fat, suppresses inflammation, so on and so forth, improves atherosclerosis. So it's just the opposite of what they were saying before. Conclusion, C8 may represent a promising nutrient against chronic inflammatory diseases. Say what? That's just the opposite of the previous 70 years. And it goes on, it says, here we go, medium chain fatty acids, MCFAs, which are the same as MCTs, can reduce body fat accumulation and improve cholesterol metabolism. Just the opposite. We found in contrast that long chain fatty acids, MCTs, the medium chain triglycerides, C8, C10, have a potential for reducing LDL and total cholesterol, should you be interested in that, but improving HDL. So saturated fats improve HDL. That's how you get increased HDL from saturated fats. Okay, saturated fats may favorably increase blood HDL, without significant changes of total cholesterol and HDL ratio. Pretty interesting. And it goes a few details there. It's in human milk. So now we're getting to the bottom of it. So that's where I'm going to leave you. That's the basis. We'll pick up from there in another video, but I want you to know cholesterol is good for you, saturated fats are good for you, HDL is directly related to saturated fats, and off and away you go. Till next time. Bye-bye.